from KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. On air and online, this is Intersection.
Hello and welcome to Intersection, where people and ideas meet online and on KBIA. I'm Ryan Famuliner. Nearly 12% of Missouri residents live in poverty, according to U.S. Census data released last month. When you look at single mothers with dependent children, that number shoots up to 44%. Those figures were released in the midst of a larger debate over how effective government handouts are at reducing poverty. In September, the U.S. House of Representatives voted to slash funding to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which is also commonly known as food stamps. Part of that debate is around a proposal to require able-bodied adults to seek work or job training if they want food stamps. But a job doesn't guarantee a ticket out of poverty. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, more than 7% of Americans who work more than half of the year are still living below the federal poverty level, and that percentage has gone up. It was less than 5% in the year 2000. Today on Intersection, we'll take a closer look at the causes of poverty in Missouri and talk about what's being done to try to bring folks out of it. Jeanette Mott Oxford is the executive director of the Missouri Association for Social Welfare and a former state representative. Jeanette, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Sandy Rikoon is a professor in MU's Department of Rural Sociology and is the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security, which just published its 2013 version of the Missouri Hunger Atlas. Sandy, thanks for joining us.
Hey, pleasure to be here.
And Matt Foulkes is an associate professor in the MU Department of Geography. He also worked on the Hunger Atlas project, and in addition to a study on the geography of food insecurity, he also tracks the migration patterns and behaviors of the rural poor. Matt, thanks for being here.
Thrilled to be here.
All right. We'd also love to hear from you and our audience. What should state authorities do to help the poor? We want to hear your suggestions. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet at @intersectKBIA. And so off the top here, I just want to throw out just kind of, it seems like a very basic question, but what are some of the things that keep people in poverty in Missouri and in the U.S. right now? I don't know, Jeanette, so start off with you.
Well, so many jobs pay less than the cost of living is. And the minimum wage can get stuck for a long, long time since it takes, acts of Congress to move things up. We had a 10-year period where the minimum wage didn't go up at all. There is a living wage calculator that comes out of MIT that shows county by county across the United States what the cost of living is. In St. Louis City and County, for example, it costs about $19.22, I believe it is, for a mother with 2 children to have enough for basic human needs, and yet, a $7.35 an hour job is going to leave you way below that. Even if 2 parents were working at minimum wage, you would be below what shelter and utilities and transportation, the real essentials cost, not looking at any kind of like savings program or anything like that.
In the intro, we talked a little bit about how, especially the working poor, that population's been growing over the last 10 years or so. Some people might say, well, we'll point to the recession as maybe one of the causes of that. Is that a fair thing to point at, or is it just, I don't know, what would you say to that equation there?
Well, I think it's true that the number of working poor have increased, but my understanding is that the percent of working poor is as a percentage of the labor force is remarkably stable, which actually would point to the wages that Jeanette talked about. That so this is a persistent problem in my mind that goes beyond the recession. It was made worse by the recession, but the working poor has been a problem that we've faced in this country for quite some time, and I think you have to look at the recession, and you have to look at other changes like welfare reform in 1996, and you have to look at the changing mix of jobs as other factors that have maintained the working poor.
Yeah,
and the number of children living in extreme poverty, meaning less than $2 per person per day, has gone up like 140% since welfare reform of 1996. So I would hesitate to declare a victory in the 1996 welfare reform bill that passed. I know a lot of folks do. They claim, look, the rolls have gotten smaller or whatever. Well, you can create a program that's so bad that no one will participate in it and declare victory, but the real thing is to help families move forward and be able to thrive, and I think the opposite came out of the welfare reform of 1996.
Right. Sandy, go ahead.
Well, I would just add that a fair amount of the people I come in contact with are not able to work. So they're disabled, they're elderly, and so on. So really their situation of poverty has nothing to do with wages, but it has to do with the limit of the welfare, the social welfare net that exists. And they get X amount of dollars per month, and that amount of dollars, which is all they have coming in, puts them under the poverty level.
And
That's a really excellent point, because our disability system seems to assume that you're either totally able-bodied and sound of mind, or you're totally disabled. And the reality is a whole lot of people live in a continuum in the middle there, and the rules don't acknowledge that you can be somewhere in the middle. I have many friends who deal with something like depression. That means they can't hold down a 40-hour-a-week job, but they could work some. However, the earnings rules for their disability program cuts them off if they make, an amount of money that actually might supplement their check enough that they can afford, what they need to live on. So we have several problems there. One is a disability system that isn't flexible enough to acknowledge the reality of disability. Another is our earnings rules, including the federal poverty level that we keep citing. That's an outdated formula from the 1950s that's no longer accurate, and the number of people who are truly poor, meaning they can't afford adequacy, is probably at least double what we say is officially poor. So we use bad numbers, and it's hard for me to believe we'll have good public policy if your numbers cause you to lie right at the heart of the matter, and then why not set up rules so that people are encouraged to work as much as they can and not punish them for that.
So what would some of those changes look like, I guess? How would those changes come to be? Is something that's happening at the state level, the federal level, a little bit of both? Or
It could be both, yeah. The federal poverty level is set at the federal level, and it's based on just a thrifty food plan and multiplying it by a number, because when they started using it as a measurement, poor people tended to spend about a third of their money on food. But things have changed since then. It also was based on two-parent home with a stay-at-home parents and no need to pay for childcare, et cetera. So it doesn't reflect modern realities. So changing that at the federal level and keeping it updated for the cost of living instead of having to go back and win it periodically, like the minimum wage not being indexed to inflation and you have to go back and win changes in it. Having COLAs built into programs would be a good idea.
I think that those are all good points. I think when you were mentioning welfare reform in the 90s, it was. I think now in hindsight, I feel that it was a statistical win based on some moral ideas about what poverty was. And if you look at recent reports that are out that say that initially many people were moved off the welfare rolls, as President Clinton claimed in his Democratic National Convention speech, I think, for when Obama was inaugurated the second time. But and he was quick to claim that because that was under his administration, of course. But now the problem was that those benefits were I don't think they were inflation adjusted, and so those benefits stayed the same, and they were given to the states in the form of block grants. And over the years, what's happened is states have basically used the initial savings that for people moving off the rolls, and they've put that into other programs that they've diverted the funds. So the real cash assistance to needy families has gone way down, and the number of families served has gone down, and it's become disconnected from the growing need. So in the late 90s with the booming economy, you saw there was less families below the official poverty line, which I agree is flawed, and then now you see the number of needy families going up, but there's the TANF cases have not increased. So that legislation again was a statistical victory initially, and it now I think you can't argue with the numbers that there are less people receiving benefits and the benefits are smaller. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or bad thing comes into the kind of the moral and political spectrum things on poverty.
Well, and what do you think? One of the options that's being thrown out there on during the SNAP debate at the federal level is talking about tying food stamps to employment or job training. Do you think we could see a similar phenomenon if that step was taken, or what are your thoughts on that? Taking into account what happened in 1996 and after that.
Well, I those policies are usually based on this notion that that the only deserving needy people are people who are working and so forth. And it's based on a very specific view of what causes poverty. And so I can see, some of the similar problems happening. It depends on the availability of good jobs. We saw that, I've seen other studies that show that there's only welfare reform, even in the late 90s when the economy was booming, can only claim like 20 to 30% of the people moved off rolls. In other words, it was jobs created by the booming economy, and the earned income tax credit, is partially, credited with moving people off welfare rolls. So I think that, I think there are some analogies to basing a policy just on that.
If unemployment keeps going down, Missouri will have to implement the part of the 1996 welfare reform law that says that unless you're in an approved work activity, you can only get food stamps. If you're an able-bodied adult without dependents, you can only get food stamps for 3 months out of every 3 years. So within the next 2 years, at current trends, we will have to go back to implementing that. But I think that's a really flawed policy. Because it's not truly a work requirement; it's just a time limit, and the assumption is all you need to find work is the threat that we're going to take your benefits away and you will find a job. But that's not how life really works. I always like to say that the economy is like a game of musical chairs. We play the music stops, everybody runs for a chair, and somebody doesn't get one, and each round we take another chair away. And we can blame the person who doesn't get the chair and is out of the game and say, you didn't listen to the music carefully enough. You didn't run quite enough. I came in here walking with a cane today, so I can't get to the chair quite as fast as people. That's how real life is. And the thing is, the economy doesn't have enough chairs, meaning jobs for everybody. So some of us are not going to get one. How do we treat people who don't get a job? I'd like to treat them as my brother or sister and be compassionate to them. It might be my turn to not have a job someday, and I would like to have support from the community when I'm in that situation. So I think we should be more compassionate about it. And I see no benefit in making any member of the community hungry. Hunger doesn't motivate work. It actually debilitates work. It makes you have no energy and no ability to focus. And it makes you do things like lose your teeth, which makes you pretty unattractive to a person who's doing a job interview with you. Mm-hmm. So it just puts a bigger strain on helping systems in terms of food pantries.
I need to take a moment to remind our listeners that this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today on Intersection, we're taking a closer look at the causes of poverty in Missouri, specifically among the working poor, and talking about what's being done to try to bring folks out of poverty. Joining us in studio today, Jeanette Mott Oxford is the Executive Director of the Missouri Association for Social Welfare and a former state representative. Sandy Rikoon is a professor in MU's Department of Rural Sociology and is the Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security, which just published its 2013 version of the Missouri Hunger Atlas. And Matt Foulkes is an Associate Professor in the MU Department of Geography. He also worked on the Hunger Atlas project and tracks the migration patterns and behaviors of the rural poor. And for you in our audience, are you a working adult that makes less than the federal poverty level? How do you make ends meet? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You can also tweet at IntersectKBIA. We'd like to remind you that you can watch Intersection as streaming video online during our live conversations every Monday afternoon at 2 at kbia.org. You can watch that video and join our online chat by going to kbia.org and scrolling down to the link for Intersection. Again, that's Mondays at 2 online at kbia.org. We have a comment actually in our chat room from Idris, said that the USA needs to redefine what poverty is and how being food insecure simply adds to the downward spiral. That kind of riffs off what you were just saying.
Right. Yeah. Hunger is not a motivator. That's quoting a former House colleague of mine who claimed that once. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and we know that, even the government admits that the poverty line is flawed because many of the programs use much larger percentages, so like the free and reduced lunch, right. The programs eligibility for programs will range between 160 and 200% of the poverty level. So even our own programs are saying, needy people don't stop at the poverty threshold.
Right.
And hunger is not just a work inhibitor, but it's a learning inhibitor. Mm-hmm. So for children, who we typically rely on education in order to make it possible for them to enter the workforce and do well. Lots of studies show that they're going to miss more school. It's going to take them longer to recover from illnesses. Mm-hmm. So they're just not, they face much greater difficulty in receiving the proper kind of education and training so that they could become effective members of the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And programs like WIC that provide food, protein and iron-rich food for pregnant women and nursing women and children, save $4 in the healthcare cost for each dollar we spend on food. So there's a real cost savings if we focus on getting things right. Certainly, with a child's brain developing so much in the first 3 years of life, we need to really pour resources into that population.
Sure. And before we jump too far into the food security insecurity issue, I do want to ask one more question about that kind of this phenomenon you were talking about, Jeanette, where there is an argument out there that some people think that poverty is tied to personal choice or tied to lack of motivation. What would you say to somebody who makes that kind of argument?
Well, I certainly find that there's a real range of character among people of all income levels. You'll find, folks that are, hard workers at all income levels. You'll find folks that are liars at all income levels. So it's poverty. There's seldom a correlation. My father was pretty poor most of his life, and I've never seen a man work harder than my dad. So there's just cases that we could cite where there's not a connection between how hard you work and how much you make.
Yeah, I feel that that's always been with us, the kind of the flawed character, but argument. But the study after study shows that the hopes, dreams, aspirations of people who are classified as poor are similar, the same as people who are not, and the values are the same. It's just that this idea of a culture of poverty where values are different I don't think is borne out in research. And so, certainly, I like the way you put that, because I think that, I think what happens sometimes is people use antidote. They'll meet somebody and say, well,
Right.
this person doesn't seem that, hardworking as me. And look all that I've entailed. Well, that's already
something to measure too, but yeah.
Exactly, and it's bringing your own kind of suppositions to the table about that. When it's right, there's why are we holding the poor to higher standards than at every level? I don't,
And a lot of our bad public policy is about just ignorance about what people's real lives are like. The other day I was at a Senate hearing about Medicaid expansion, and someone referred to a poor person missing a medical appointment as being about culture. You just use the word culture, that some people are irresponsible because they're not showing up. And I raised the issue that it's not about culture, that when you made the appointment, you really intended to show up on November 17th, but on November 12th, you got a disconnect notice for your utilities, and winter is coming on. And so being a parent that wants to be responsible, where do you start putting your time and energy into trying to prevent this utility disconnection? And the place you need to go, in fact, you'll need to go to like 8 or 12 of them, because some of them aren't going to have aid, and some of them are only open on Tuesday afternoon, and some of them are only open on Wednesday evening, etc. It's going to just absorb all of your time for a while to manage to avoid this utility disconnection that you can't afford to handle on your own, given what your wages are. So it's about love for your children and trying to keep them from being cold, that you missed your medical appointment. You didn't know you were going to get a utility disconnect notice right before your medical appointment. So if people had to walk a mile in the shoes of those with low incomes, they would shut their mouths about some of these things.
Well, I think that there's different things, reasons people believe that poverty exists, but this kind of, again, this like personal choices, or if you want to call it flawed character arguments, really, that you could argue they serve a couple purposes, and one is to, class insecurity. Obviously, if you believe that people are poor because they're making poor choices, then people like me, we can feel better. I can feel better about myself because I'm like, well, I really did earn what I have, and so forth. And so, obviously, but if it's just due to structural things, then it's kind of a scary thought, because that means that maybe I'm just lucky. Maybe it has nothing to do. Now,
and maybe it could happen to you.
And maybe it could happen to me. And the other thing, yeah, exactly. And so, and the other kind of thing is that it's economically attractive, because once you say it's the poor's fault that they're poor through choices, that entails like cutting programs and letting the market, the free market, which is not really free, but dictate things, and so that obviously has economic benefits. So, I mean, I think, there are obviously, any of these arguments about why people are poor have their own inherent biases. And
it's interesting listening to language, because when you introduced the show, you talked about government handouts. And, I mean, just that word, handout, has come to be a sort of pejorative term of giving something away, maybe to somebody who doesn't deserve it. And so I think it's really interesting the way that
But we don't call it that. If the St. Louis baseball Cardinals want tax dollars to build a stadium, we call it a subsidy, or a tax credit, or an incentive.
Or we call it an investment.
That kind of thing.
Multiplier effects.
And programs that help people out of poverty are investments. They're not handouts.
Yeah.
I think we need to really think about the words we're using.
Sure.
Right.
I want to take one moment to remind our listeners that this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today on Intersection, we're taking a closer look at the causes of poverty in Missouri, specifically among the working poor, and talking about what's being done to try to bring folks out of poverty. Joining us in studio today, Jeanette Mott Oxford is the Executive Director of the Missouri Association for Social Welfare and a former state representative. Sandy Rikoon is a professor in MU's Department of Rural Sociology and is the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security, which just published its 2013 version of the Missouri Hunger Atlas. And Matt Foulkes is an associate professor in the MU Department of Geography. He also worked on the Hunger Atlas project and tracks the migration patterns and behaviors of the rural poor. We'd also love to hear from you and our audience. Have you ever received SNAP payments? Was it enough? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet at IntersectKBIA. And this might be a good time to go ahead and start talking about this Hunger Atlas. Sandy, maybe tell us a little bit about what that is. And again, this is, I think, the third version of it. So maybe what did you find this time around?
So yeah, the Hunger Atlas is our attempt to do something that probably the U.S. government or the state of Missouri ought to be doing, but we have no Department of Hunger in Missouri, or in the whatever food programs we have are under the United States Department of Agriculture. And so hunger, the documentation of hunger and the collection of data on hunger simply in this country is fairly minimal. So a group of faculty, including Matt and Joan Hermsen in sociology, and Nikki Radicke in nutrition, Colleen Heflin in public policy, we decided that we would try to step into this gap by producing a document, electronic and written, that would help people in Missouri understand the distribution of hunger in the state. And we would define hunger according to various measures that either we developed or that we could find at agencies. I mean, there are agencies that work on hunger programs, but they're pretty spread out, and there is nothing that brings their data together. And so we wanted to document hunger, but we also wanted to document how well were the counties of Missouri doing in terms of trying to meet the needs of those who were food insecure. How are they doing in terms of getting participation in the SNAP program, in the food stamp program? How about kids who were eligible for WIC? How about children that were eligible for free and reduced lunch programs in schools? So we want to measure what we call performance. And so the Hunger Atlas both talks about need on a county level, and then it talks about performance. And we have more data than you would probably ever want to see in the book, but we also have some nice maps, so you can quickly see, where are the highest levels of food insecurity in the state, or the highest levels of performance, or the highest levels of participation in SNAP.
And how are we doing? What are some of the key takeaways, I guess, for you in this most recent version?
Well, I mean, if you look at Missouri as a state, we're doing horribly. I mean, number one, throughout the last 12 years, we've been doing worse every year. That even times when the so-called economy was so-called booming, it wasn't an equitable booming that was taking place. And so the Missouri levels of food insecurity, that is, people who are worried about having enough food, as well as those who actually experience hunger because they shown in reducing intake, skipping meals, and things like that. I mean, it's been on the rise consistently over the last 15 years. In the state of Missouri, we've gone from an average of about 9% food insecure to over 16%. And that rise in percent of population that's food insecure is the highest in the country. That's 7% rise. In terms of those who actually experience hunger, 12, 14 years ago, it averaged about 2%, 2.2%. Now it's getting up close to 7%. And so that rate has actually tripled over the last 12 years. Again, the highest increase in the country.
Wow.
So there's not much good news to report from Missouri.
What about urban, rural? Is one area doing better or worse than the other? Or, Matt, I know that's your territory too, but
go ahead, Matt.
Well, I think in the three versions of the Hunger Atlas, we found that food insecurity affects all areas, urban, rural, and suburban areas too, which is a lot of people think of the suburbs as the affluent places, but even in those places, there's definitely while the percentage of people who are food insecure may be lower than other places, just because so many people live in the suburbs, it's a huge amount of people, and so there's a lot of need in the suburbs. But of course, I think it mirrors, kind of the economic landscape in general. So I'm interested in rural areas, and rural areas have been, hard hit. I mean, with job opportunities and so forth, and you see fairly high food insecurity levels. But I think what strikes me as a geographer is that how widespread and prevalent it is. You just can't say, traditionally the boot heel has been a very poor area of the state, but it's not just the boot heel. It's not just the places we think that are poor that food insecurity happens. It happens everywhere.
And I mean, again, there are a lot of factors that go into this ecoation, right? What are the ones? Do we have any idea which ones are the root causes here? As far as, is it just accessibility, or is it the economics of it, or
it begins with some objective measures. So, a family that's at 50% poverty is much more likely to be food insecure than a family that's at 100% poverty. But a family that's at 125 or 150% poverty still may be food insecure. The percentages get lower. So when we just simply model food insecurity using those factors that are likely to predict it, so poverty, unemployment, female-headed households, things like that, we get a pretty good idea of where food insecurity lies. But to that, I think we have to add something that we've already been talking about. You can find two families that are both at the same level of poverty, one food insecure and one not food insecure.
Right.
So what's the difference? Well, one of the differences is the SNAP program. Are they participating in SNAP, or are they not participating in SNAP? It turns out that rural areas, actually, while there's some high levels of participation in the boot heel, for example, there are other rural areas, North Missouri, for example, where there's very low participation. So families up in North Missouri that are at the poverty level are more likely to be food insecure because they aren't participating as well in the SNAP program. So there's the objective measure of poverty and female-headed households and so on. And then there's sort of the subjective experience of participation, of ability to have to draw on community resources for food. Is there a food bank or a food pantry nearby? What's housing costs? Is there affordable housing, or if there's not affordable housing, then they're more likely to be food insecure. So you're right, it's a very complicated
one thing gives one.
Are you a victim of domestic violence? Do you get along with your parents and your grandparents? Are they in the same state where you are? I mean, there's just all kinds of factors involved.
And we'll probably talk about SNAP program a little bit more here in a little bit, but we have to take a short break. I want to remind our listeners, this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. Today on Intersection, we're taking a closer look at the causes of poverty in Missouri, specifically among the working poor, and talking about what's being done to try to bring folks out of poverty. Joining us in studio today, Jeanette Mott is the Executive Director of the Missouri Association for Social Welfare. Sandy Rikoon is a professor in MU's Department of Rural Sociology and is the Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security, and Matt Foulkes is an Associate Professor in the MU Department of Geography. I'm Ryan Famuliner. We'll be right back after a short break.